to the Artistic Vision podcast, where we talk about theology and the arts. We have theologians, visual artists, other people. And today we have a poet and an educator named Dr. Benjamin Myers. He teaches at Oklahoma Baptist University. He was the Poet Laureate of Oklahoma in 2015 and 16. Renowned, well-known, good poet. And he's also the director of the honors program at Oklahoma Baptist. And today we talked about one of his books, mostly called The Poetics of Orthodoxy, which I mentioned, but it's what I hope we're doing with the kind of the visual arts world, with the sacramental imagination. He kind of takes the poetic world and does the same way in poetry, that it's not just about the material words, and it's not just about the sentiment behind the words, that it's in the realness of the two coming together that makes a good poem or good art and reflects the beautiful one in whose image it's made. What did you enjoy about the conversation?
I liked what he had to say on sentimentality.
Yeah.
And he's funny.
Yeah.
He's got an infectious laugh. I really enjoyed it. It made me want to learn more about him and to hang out.
Yeah. He's a good guy. Having hung out with him, it's worth it. And I think the other thing that I think is worth tuning in for is an encouragement to practice local art. To not be discouraged that you're not the most produced. This is what something we talked about when I was with him a few years ago, like just not feeling like I'm a poet that has anything useful to say, or you feel like your art's not as good as whatever, that your community needs your poetry. Your community needs your visual art. It doesn't have to be amazing. It can just be yours, and people will like it and pay attention to it. So do it.
Good. Yeah, let's do it. Let's listen to Ben.
All right, Dr. Ben Myers, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yeah. The first question we ask all our guests is, what's your beginning with beauty? So sometimes you kind of arrive later on, sometimes you're born with it. What's kind of your background?
That's such a good question. I'm not sure I can answer it without getting a little bit sort of into corny Wordsworthian territory, but
go for it.
Okay, good. Yeah. Probably, like many people, nature, growing up in rural Oklahoma, spent most of my time outdoors, wandering about on the southern plains. And so I think, it was really that sort of free range childhood in which you'd almost have to stumble into wonder in a childhood of just sort of knocking around outside, especially far from home, as from town as we were, sort of all trees and grass and streams. And so that was really it. And then I grew up in a household that emphasized beauty in the form of the written word. My father was a poet. My mother is a novelist. And so a house full of books, including literature, philosophy, art. So that was really, I didn't really grow up around or aware of any liturgical attention to beauty. It was really, at first, in my mind at least, a purely secular sort of thing.
And am I making this up? Which I could be. Was there like a punk rock component of your kind of arrival at poetry?
Yeah, well, there was a lot of there were punk bands that I played in, and alt rock bands, and a little bit toward the latter in there was the grunge era. So and there were moments of beauty in that. Often not of my own doing. It was more likely the work of our keyboard player that
the beauty element. Yeah. I would love to hear your answer on what the role of beauty is in the life of a Christian. I think maybe if we distill that down into how it relates to poetry, is like, why not just write a paragraph explaining what you're saying? What does what does beauty do? What does yeah.
I think the starting place for beauty in the arts is beauty as a transcendental signifier, that beauty points us always to God, that God is beauty, and so any beauty we encounter in the world is pointing us to him. And I think it does so in a particular way, a way maybe a little different from what truth and goodness do, because beauty creates a sense of longing in a very direct way. I always point out to my students, think about a time in which you saw something so beautiful that it hurts. Why should that be the case? Why would beauty hurt, right? But beauty creates this kind of sense of longing in us. I always think of Yeats's wonderful poem, The Song of Wandering Angus, where he goes out fishing and he catches a fish, and it turns into this beautiful girl with apple blossoms in her hair, who he says calls me by my name and ran and vanished in the brightening air. And there's this way that beauty kind of calls us by our name and runs, right? And I think the point is so that we will run after beauty toward God. So for me, beauty is about that awakening that longing for eternity and for God.
Yeah. So in terms of poetry, I wonder what you think makes a good poem.
Yeah. Oh, so much to talk about there. And
It's written by
in some
Ben
ways,
Myers.
it's a lot easier to say what makes a bad poem. That's kind of
start
the
there.
track I took in the book. But
Yeah.
I think Gnosticism makes a bad poem, right?
Mm.
That to really connect with the reader, to get that beauty in the poem, to call the reader's name, it has to come into the physical world. There has to be incarnation in the poem. We tend to think of ourselves as souls trapped in bodies, but we're not, right? We're soul body unities, and any emotional experience, and even any idea we've had in our physical body, in a particular place, at a particular time, right? And so the example I use a lot is, if you have ever fallen in love, something people write about in poetry a lot, right? You've not fallen in love nowhere. You've fallen in love while standing under a tree, or sitting in traffic, or walking down a particular sidewalk. And so a lot of poetry goes wrong by trying to just jump to that feeling, right? And so you'll read a love poem and it will say something like, I love you very much, I love you very, very, very much. It's like, well, you can say that all day long, but it's not going to connect until it becomes embodied, right? Until it's there in the world where we actually experience the emotion, the thought, the whole experience of living.
I'm wondering, you connected poetry, you said like you had a secular background in poetry, but you didn't kind of encounter liturgical beauty. I'm curious. I mean, we Gary and I kind of focus on the visual arts more, which traditionally there's church architecture that or church paintings, all these things that you encounter visually. What role would you say poetry could play in the liturgical life of a Christian?
Yeah. I think poetry can play only the role of poetry in the liturgical life of the Christian, right? A lot of times there are these painfully awkward moments sometimes in church services where it's sort of like, and now a poem, and the whole congregation is sort of looking at you like, what is happening here, right? So, I'm a big advocate, of course, for one way poetry can play a major role in liturgical experiences, just bringing the Psalms more directly into the worship experience, right? And whether it's the reading of the Psalms or the singing of the Psalms, right? But also, that poetry, the arts don't have to be centered in, we don't have to disrupt ancient liturgies in order to work in contemporary art, right? They don't have to be centered in the 10 to 11:30 slot on Sunday morning, but they're more meaningfully worked into the Christian life as part of the larger liturgy of living and following Christ. So, for instance, my university president got up at our faculty meeting, university-wide faculty meeting this morning, and he started with reading an Advent poem by Scott Carnes from Malcolm Guite's Advent book, right? And it was a wonderful kind of liturgical moment, right? Outside of the specified Sunday morning liturgy, outside of the what in the Baptist tradition we would call the order of service. And so for me, I think it's more important to return the arts to the life of the church than it is to return them to the programming of the church. Which isn't to say, if you happen to have a Bach in your congregation, by all means, go ahead and feature that.
No, I think that's so true. I think one of the complaints that we hear sometimes is like the church doesn't value my art because we don't use it in the service. And there's some things that just like I don't know how we would incorporate some of those things. And I think that kind of thing, just because it's not in the liturgy doesn't mean it can't be part of the larger life of the Christian.
Absolutely, and the same thing's true for the auto mechanic in the congregation. Obviously, we're not going to have him fixing cars at the altar, right? But it doesn't mean there's not a valued contribution to the life of the church there.
You've never been to Redeemer.
Oh, that's great. First the Eucharist and then car talk.
Oh, it's funny. You wrote this book called Poetics of Orthodoxy, which has probably been a while now. When did that come out?
Oh, goodness. I think it's 2018, maybe.
2018.
Has it been that long?
And I've always, even talking to Gary about our book that we put together, I've always kind of viewed your book as a precursor to ours. What you're doing with poetry, or what you did with poetry, I kind of wanted us to do with the visual art specifically, because you pave a way through kind of the material words and the sentimental feelings. And I think like the kind of rationalism and the kind of postmodern sentimentality. And you wrote, nonetheless, we can say that a poem or any work is beautiful when it, by whatever means, brings the thisness of the world forcefully to us in a way that does not separate matter from emotion, but rather encourages their intermingling. What do you mean by that?
Yeah. And a lot of that is kind of what I was talking about with resisting that Gnostic urge, right? But also acknowledging, by thisness, I'm really thinking about the way poetry and really all art draws our attention to being, right? I mean, the first fundamental thing art notices is that isn't it kind of wild that stuff exists, including us, right? We're here. In some ways, art is an acknowledgement that we're here. And of course, being is, again, synonymous with truth, goodness, and beauty. All of that is as created being because God is as uncreated being. And so for a poem, a picture to really carry meaning for us, right, I think it has to kind of first ground itself in that fact of being, which is going to be different in different things, right? In poetry, it has a lot to do with concreteness of imagery, right? Avoiding, as Pound said, go in fear of abstractions, right? Not because the abstractions don't matter, but because you just can't get to them by going straight to them, right? You need that grounding in painting. It might actually be the physicality of the paint itself. When you look at paintings online, it's a very different experience than going to the museum and just seeing how Van Gogh or Jasper Johns just layers on the paint. And so finding ways to ground poetic practice or artistic practice in just the fact of existence, I think, is important as an artist.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, along those lines, you give a great little kind of like a little story about the way sentimentality functions by referring to Thomas Kincaid and a student, an interaction. Could you talk a little bit more about that and what you meant by that?
Yeah. So, I accused the student of sending pornography to her grandmother. And like many of the most outlandish things, we say we can blame it on Flannery O'Connor. She
Yeah.
was the first one to notice this connection between the pornographic and the sentimental, right? In a great book on writing called Mystery and Manners, O'Connor suggests that pornography and like sentimental art, sentimental writing are essentially the same in that they try to give you the sort of the thin end goal of the thing instead of the actual thing itself, or pornography tries to skip the actual human connection and just give you the gratification, right? And sentimentality as well actually kind of skips the actual human connection to just give you that sort of satisfaction of emotional experience. So, it's even, and it's sort of the great damage it does to the people involved in pornography is that they're real people, but they're not treated like real people. Maybe it's less damaging in sort of just sentimental writing because they're not actually real people. But it's the same thing. There's a kind of utility that empties out the actual humanness and connection of it. And so, I bless his heart, Thomas Kincaid, very, very popular. But, those paintings, especially, I guess maybe it bugs me, especially those sort of rural cottage paintings. It's kind of like, I've lived in the sticks my whole life, and it just is not like that. You know, not that it, the problem I try to emphasize, the problem is not that he's going for beauty. The problem is just there are no shortcuts to beauty. Um, that you can't. I was talking about this in another context. If you want to write about hope, you have to write about suffering. Otherwise, what is hope for? Right? And the same thing's true of beauty. Beauty is, to me, a kind of grace. It's a sort of inexplicable presence in the world. We don't deserve it, but there it is. And cheap beauty is cheap grace.
Yeah, I was wanting to get your thoughts on this. I think the common critique in Christian circles is that sentimentality is mostly spiritualist, kind of like bypassing the realities of the world in order for a more favorable, even heavenly reality. And so again, you're bypassing reality in some sense. And so artists, kind of even in Christian circles, I think in our church and and the people I interact with, it seemed like in a way that they rebel against that because they don't want to be associated with Christian art. But in doing so, I was wondering if you've seen a sentimentality on the materialist side that sort of commiserates in suffering and loathes, pain and stuff like that, and doesn't acknowledge the. So if it's an imbalance of emotion, which I think you talk about, then isn't there a sentimentality on the other side as well?
Oh, absolutely, right. And there's most of my students are sort of inclined to one or the other. So it's all kittens and grandma's praying hands, or it's all sort of broken glass in alleyways, and that
Yeah.
kind of thing. And so
Yeah.
yeah, there is a it's easy to be sentimentally nihilistic, I think, just to sort of lean into the shock of the despair, just for the cheap thrill of the shock of the despair. That's a common thing. Or just to go to the stock images of the gritty and the dark, is just as lazy as going to the stock images of the cozy and the comfortable. And in either one, you've lost that connection to being, right. You're no longer grounded in what actually is. You're working in just symbols that are self-referential.
Yeah, that's good.
I want to shift gears a little bit to the practical. So we kind of talked, poetic or aesthetic theory, and I think the first time I maybe came across your name was in a fellow kind of Wendell in front. And I know in your book you talked about the loss of local arts in modernity, that it's kind of become professionalized and not kind of local anymore, right? So can you talk about that, like those developments? How did that happen, and what can we do about it?
Yeah. That's a great question. It reminds me, just read in your book the other day that 1/3 of your congregation is artists. When I told that to my wife, she was astounded. That's not the experience one has in other parts of the country,
Yeah.
right? And so, artists are maybe thinner on the ground here, maybe part of my experience. But yeah, the local element, it does have a lot to do with professionalization, right? The idea that the arts are something that people who majored in it and now get paid to do it do. And that, is connected to kind of really to the outsourcing of all of our leisure, right? Like if you are living in Chandler, Oklahoma in 1907, and what are you going to do in the evening? Well, you're going to sit down at the spinet or pull out the banjo, right, and make your own music. um, Even when I was a kid, much more limited options. We would have to, what are we going to do today? We've run out of things to do. Let's write a play and put that on for the family. And now it's just so easy to just dial up somebody else's professionally produced entertainment. And in that, leisure becomes entertainment, and the two kind of become synonymous. And B, they become provided rather than self-produced, right? I mean, it's not all that different from kind of what's happened to us with food. It's all something done somewhere else, and we just sort of bring it in at our convenience, and pretty soon nobody knows how to do it anymore. And so that's part of it. And then because of that professionalization, then they're kind of arises a sense that, well, the local art must be the lesser art, right? If this stuff was any good, it'd be happening in New York, or it'd be what would good art be doing here, right? Is often the attitude. And even I hear lots of poets sort of speak of the major leagues, the minor leagues, the farm team, and I sort of think, well, hey, I like farms, and B, the goal doesn't necessarily have to be to reach the most distant audience possible. And I think that should be more clear now, because the national audience for the arts has fragmented so much anyway, that you could be, the most nationally read person in your little niche and still have a smaller audience than you'd have if you just went to the local literary festival, and so yeah, I think we're due for a reevaluation of local art within the local life of the community.
That's good. That's right. So you have a new book coming very soon, right? Could you
Yes,
tell us a little bit about it, and what do you hope it will do in the lives of the readers?
I appreciate that question. Yeah, it's out in 4 days, I guess.
Oh my word!
December 10th, a book called Ambiguity and Belonging, which is largely about place. It's really kind of a collection of essays, some published in various places, not a few from the Front Porch Republic,
Shout out.
and then some new. I've sprinkled in new work along the way in there to offer something not available elsewhere. And so, kind of addressing three main topics that preoccupy me: place, poetry, and education. And so occasionally the intersection of all three, when I can bring them together.
That's great.
Sounds good.
I'm curious. Right, we're in the aftermath of a hurricane that kind of devastated our region. We talked offline before this about a tornado coming through Oklahoma a few years ago, and we've talked with a few different people about Mako Fujimura most recently, who talked about his experience in New York City, 9/11, and kind of the art that came out of that for him. I'm curious, what did the tornado do for your poetry, your creative practice? Did it destabilize you? Did it enhance it? What kind of was your creative life like in that time?
Well, that's interesting. I being an Oklahoman, it's almost like never occurred to me to think of a single tornado as an event. It's just sort of the constant presence of
Sure.
tornadoes.
Yeah, that's fair.
And I live distant from campus a little bit. I live in the town I grew up in, which is about 20 miles from campus. So we weren't hit at all, which was fortunate. Was able to open the house up to students and colleagues and that sort of thing. And so it really didn't disrupt my writing really at all. In fact, classes were canceled for a couple of days. So I think I may have actually
Free
written
time.
more. I'm
Yeah.
a little guilty now that I think about it. Um, but, in general, I think that, the constant kind of somewhere every year gets hit. And, I was just watching a news report this morning on recovery efforts in a town not too far away. And so writing as an Oklahoman, there is this kind of, I think it's helped me cultivate an awareness of maybe fragility and the sort of always conditional nature of everyday life, right? As I mean, you can be going about what you think is the course of a regular year, and then out of nowhere, right? And so kind of two things. One is that is an important reminder as an artist, because it keeps us sort of grounded in the human condition as a writer. It keeps us thinking about what it means to be human. And I think those are also, it wasn't this tornado, but there have been events, both personal and larger in the past, that have made me think, okay, is this a time to keep writing? Or should I be doing something else, right? And of course, obviously, sometimes the answer is no. Don't write today. Get up and go help your neighbor clean up from what happened. But also, I think about that great C.S. Lewis essay, "Learning in Wartime." He's talking to his students, and they're saying, "Look, it's the middle of World War II. Should we be studying English literature right now? Because we could all die at any minute." And Lewis says, "Well, actually, you could always die at any minute. And if it's worth studying any time, it's worth studying now." Right. And so sometimes the hurricane or the tornado, when we find ourselves turning to art still in those conditions, it's a reminder that this must be a fundamental human activity. This must be worth doing even now, whether it's the war or the hurricane or the tornado.
That's great. Well, I know we're getting to time, so we have this last question, which we ask all our guests: is what's something you'd want to share with artists who call themselves Christian?
Yeah. Oh, that's such a good question, right? And in part, my first instinct on that is, look to better sources than me on that question. Right? The first thing I would say is, don't listen to what I say when you've got Eliot and Lewis to listen to. But I guess, I mean, I was talking about this morning with a colleague, kind of regarding our Great Books program, and I think you guys are really wonderful on this in your book. That it's about integration, right? That these things, when isolated, right? I'm a Christian, I'm an artist, I'm a father, I'm a congregation member, I'm a faculty member. When we put all of that in their little box, then it all becomes meaningless, right? That the meaningfulness comes in the connection of all these things, right? And so I guess I would say that, and I would also say that I think caring about beauty is inherent in the gospel, that it is inherent in the Christian tradition, that if someone finds him or herself saying, I'm a Christian, but I'm not really into beauty, I would suggest maybe you're missing something. Go back to the Psalms. That it matters when the leper in Acts begs at the beautiful gate. That in some sense, part of being a Christian and desiring that healing from Christ is to beg at the beautiful gate.
Yeah, that's great. If beauty's a name for God, then if you don't like beauty, then what's that say about you?
That's not a good thing to be indifferent to. No.
Right. Yeah. Oh man. Well, thanks so much. Thanks for being here on
you.
your last day of class and making time for us. Really appreciate it.
It's been a great pleasure. Thank you.